Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we're going to talk about a new technical Q&A that's come out of the AICPA. In fact, this was actually requested by a client, and so not often that I have a specific request for the blog, but when one pops up, always happy to honor that request. So this one is for you. So third-party assessments. This is something that the AICPA must get a lot of questions about because in the end they decided to do a technical Q&A to answer some of those more popular questions. So this TQA did come out in January of 2021 and it answers two questions. The first one is, what is a third-party assessment? And then two, what standards apply when you're performing a third-party assessment? Now, remember, TQAs are not authoritative, but they do go through a process and are approved by the AICPA and usually provide really helpful information for those of us who are trying to perform these types of services. So the first question is probably the most important one, which is, what is a third-party assessment program? And this was a governmental client who had asked about it and in particular wanted to know what qualified. And so this is where I sent them to, which is a federal or state agency, so they can be either industry consortium or group of subject matter experts, which are going to be referred to as a program body. So anyone really can get together, industry orientation, governmental entities, and can determine that it needs information about a specific subject matter. And so one example provided is security controls over sensitive information, right? That's one example of a subject matter that it needs certain information about and then from its members or other entities with whom it does business, for example, contractors, vendors, or customers. And so basically it wants to have certain information. The program body may develop a third-party assessment program that establishes either the requirements or the instructions for entities to provide the requested information to the program body along with an evaluation performed by a third-party assessor. Now, very important here, this assessor does not necessarily have to be a CPA. So this is something that pops up every once in a while. It's just saying I need a third party to provide this. Now, CPAs are experts in providing third party opinions, conclusions, findings, etc. And so often can be asked to perform these types. And so these are not being requested and not necessarily done under a particular standard. They're being done because of this consortium or the government has the standards to which they want a third party to go through. And so the assessor's evaluation is used by the program body to determine whether to certify them or authorize them or some other form of approval as a result. And so there are certain key characteristics that we have to look out for. So the first one is that the criteria has to be publicly available. So whatever the rules are going to be, the benchmark to which we are going to determine whether you're compliant or not has to be publicly available to be used to measure or evaluate the subject matter. We call this a framework. And so when we were talking earlier about the subject matter, it could be controls over security, and there would be certain publicly available measurements to which we could determine whether or not someone was compliant. Typically, this program body goes through a due process, right? They put them out there for public comment, they get exposure drafts, they get feedback, and then they release the criteria. So that's a typical characteristic here. And then because the program body develops the framework or incorporates the existing framework into the third-party assessment, that framework is therefore deemed to be appropriate by the body to meet the objective of the third-party assessment program. So by developing it, that becomes an acceptable benchmark for us to be able to perform certain types of procedures. Another characteristic is that it requires the subject matter to be measured or evaluated against that framework. So at the end of the day, they come up with a list of criteria and the assessor is going to then say, hey, have you actually met this? And so the third-party assessment sometimes can be a self-assessment. But it could also be that they require a third-party assessor and then or a separate assessor. And then the entity is responsible for the subject matter and, if applicable, the assessment of the subject matter based on the framework. So in this scenario, we're going to benchmark against it. It can be a self-assessment. And at the end of the day, the entity is responsible for that subject matter. No one else is responsible for them being compliant. And then another characteristic here is that it approves an individual organization as an assessor under the third-party assessment program based on some type of educational or experience requirements. And so CPAs, because we have our educational requirements, we have our CPE requirements, because we have our ethics requirements, we are often excellent assessors, even if we're not performing it under an AICPA engagement type, for example, an AUP or an examination. We can still perform procedures that have been identified and evaluate them. And so they establish guidelines for evaluating the quality of the assessor's work. The third-party assessment program also includes requirements regarding the assessor's objectivity or independence. So again, self-assessment, not necessarily independent, but if it's a third-party assessor, what is the requirements in terms of independence? And typically they do not necessarily require a CPA. So both non-CPAs and CPAs can be assessors. And so sometimes clients will ask a CPA to be an assessor, and the CPA has to decide, well, what am I going to do with this? Another characteristic that you would expect to see in these types of programs is that the third-party assessor has to comply with the requirements or the instructions in the program, such as the procedures to be performed, the method to be used to communicate. So they're going to tell you the procedures that they want. They're going to tell you how to provide the information through a portal, through a report, and they're going to tell you how they want it. So that's typically what we're going to see here. If you don't meet one of these characteristics, typically then the TQA doesn't apply. We would expect to see those. Now, there could be other characteristics, but these are not required. These are in addition to sort of the required ones, which is they could require certain frequency of the assessment. They can include certain information regarding the materiality that's going to be used, and then the availability of the report. But that's not critical to meeting the characteristics. So assume you have been asked to perform a third-party assessment. The second question is trying to figure out, well, what standards apply, right? So an assessor typically performs procedures outlined in the program, right? So they are telling us the procedures that are going to be performed, how we're going to describe the results or the conclusions regarding them. And if they ask a member or a CPA to perform this assessment, the question is, what do I have to do? What standards do I have to follow? And so first and foremost, this is a professional service, and therefore you do have to follow the AICPA code. So that's your basic starting point. Because this is a professional service that you're being required to, or you're being asked to perform, you do have to follow our ethics guidelines, right? So you have to follow the AICPA code and obviously the third-party assessment program. When we think about the general requirements here, professional competence, only do it if we're competent. Do professional care, right? Making sure that we perform appropriate, we do a good job when we do it, regardless of whether we're going to follow an AICPA engagement standard or not. Plan and supervision. So even if it's not an AUP, even if it's not an examination, we are still going to properly plan and perform this and supervise, and then sufficient relevant data, right? So we have to have enough data to have a reasonable basis for our conclusion, our recommendation, whatever it is that they're asking for. So that's the basic requirement. You have to follow the ethics standards. Now, you can be engaged, or you do issue an AUP, a review, or an examination under the SSAEs, or the attestation standards. And so if you are going to be engaged to provide an AUP, which is, again, findings based on procedures that have been provided, then you would be expected to also follow the SSAEs. You can also apply the statement on standards for consulting engagements. So if that's appropriate, and again, this is more about how you're engaged to do this. You're not required to follow these. However, you can structure them under these because, one, we have standards that we can follow, makes it a little bit easier. Two, we know how to do them. So we're not required to, but they can be structured accordingly. Now, if we do not structure it as an SSAE, we need to make sure that the report is very clearly not subject to the SSAEs. We want to make sure that if we're doing this and we're just following the reporting requirements and the procedures, and we're not structuring it as an AUP or as an examination, then we want to make sure that it's clearly distinguishable that this is not being performed under the SSAEs. Now, the last question is about independence, and that's independence as defined in the AICPA Code of Conduct, right? So when we think about this, there's going to be some type of definition typically in the standards in the program, right, that are going to describe independence. But from the independence rules from the AICPA's perspective, right, these are a test engagement. So if you're not performing a test engagement, if you're not performing an examination, if you're not performing an AUP, then you're not required to be independent, unless, because again, we have to, make sure, there's always an exception to every rule. So if you're performing it under the SSAEs require that you be independent per the definition under the AICPA code. However, in addition, if you're performing this as a non-attest service, you're not following the SSAEs, but the client is a financial statement client, then we have to apply the appropriate safeguards of the non-attest services to make sure that we don't impair our independence on the audit. So if this is an audit client, then you do have to consider the non-attest services. You have to make sure the client has SKI. You have to make sure that they have, someone who's overseeing. You have to make sure that you are following those requirements. And so very important here when we get into it is that general rule, if it's not an attest service, then you don't have to follow independence, unless the client gets an attest service to which this could impair our independence. We would want to make sure that we're clear there. All right, so that's it for this week's blog. Hopefully this helps clarify. I think this was something that they definitely got a lot of questions about. That's typically where we see some of these come from, the ethics hotline or from the AICPA technical hotline. And they get them so often that they decide to provide some feedback. And so I think this is going to be a really helpful one. So thank you so much for joining me today on the Genuine Learning blog, and I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.